everyone. Hope you are having a good week. I can't believe it is June already and the school year is almost over, or it is over for some of you. Today's installation of this webinar series is going to be on culturally responsive social and emotional learning. So what does it really mean to integrate SEL practices into your classroom in a way that is culturally responsive to all of your students? To begin, we will be talking about the SEL frameworks and culturally responsive teaching practices. So we are going to be connecting those, and what does that look like? You will have some time on your own to reflect and analyze on the SEL competencies for issues of equity. And really what we're doing is gaining an understanding of social and emotional learning through this cultural competency lens, and actually even moving past competency to really understand what cultural humility is. So when I use the term culture, I just want to be clear that we all have the same definition of what culture is. And when I'm talking about culture, I'm talking about a combination of thoughts, feelings, attitudes, beliefs, values, behavior patterns, and practices that are shared by either ethnic, religious, or social groups. And so I want to draw our attention to this iceberg concept, which some of you may have experienced, may have seen an iceberg concept before. We talk about it a lot in terms of behavior, right? In terms of trauma, what we can see, what we can't see. And the same is in terms of culture, right? We have pieces of culture that is primarily in our awareness, right? Literature, music, dress, cooking, right? Fine arts. And then we have a lot, and as you can see, the majority of what defines a culture is actually out of our awareness, right? These concepts of beauty, the theory of disease. Think about where we're at right now in terms of this pandemic and the theory of disease, conception of cleanliness, roles, right? Roles in relation to status by age, by sex, by class, body language, right? So there's all of these elements of culture that are really out of our awareness. You don't necessarily know about these elements unless you are interacting with different cultures, part of the culture, learning about cultures. So when we talk about cultural competence, that is really kind of like the baseline that we're talking about when we want to support individuals at varying cultures and different cultures than our own. And what cultural competence really is, it's the ability to successfully teach or work with students who come from a different culture than yours, right? It's also the practice of recognizing differences among students and families and responding positively to those differences. Meaning, when individuals are part of a culture other than your own, we are not applying a deficit model to that individual or that group of individuals. But we want to dive deeper than that, right? We don't just want to be successful working with students of different cultures. We want to start moving towards cultural humility, right? Whereas we know that cultural competency is that ability to interact effectively with different cultures, going deeper goes into cultural humility. And this is actually a process of self-exploration and self-critique combined with a willingness to learn. You want to learn from others about their experiences, right? It really means entering a relationship with another person with the intention of honoring their beliefs, their customs, their values. It means acknowledging their differences and accepting those individuals for who they are, rather than ignoring the differences. So we want to move into this cultural humility piece, right? We know when we practice cultural humility that we cannot reach a full understanding of a culture that we don't belong to. Cultural humility incorporates a lifelong commitment to self-evaluation, self-critique, to learning, to reflection, right? It's all about the process, not the goal. And when we move towards cultural humility, the purpose of this, the why behind it, is really because this is how we are going to tackle those larger issues of systemic inequity, moving into and having cultural humility, engaging in deeper dialogue, really leaning into the discomfort of the process of learning about other people's culture, of learning about not just that top piece of the iceberg, but really what is underneath it. So we're going to watch this video, and we have a couple of videos that we will be watching today. This is the introduction to culturally relevant pedagogy.
I think people, when they use the term culturally responsive or culturally relevant pedagogy, forget that the base of the word is culture. So culture has to do with worldviews, beliefs, language. It has to do with values.
Culture to me at its essence are the things that, those filters that help us as human beings make sense out of the most ordinary things. Culture can be grouped into two different kind of categories. You can talk about visible culture and invisible culture, or tangible and intangible. The tangible, I would translate that to say the crafts, the music, the art, the technology. And those are important, but I think the more important are the intangible. And these are values, beliefs, feelings, opinions, perspectives, assumptions.
So culturally relevant pedagogy, one of the primary premises is that teachers take students' everyday lived cultural experiences and make the appropriate linkages between what the students know and do and understand, and come up with examples, comparisons, and contrasts. They make the connections. They are cultural translators. They are cultural bridge builders. I think when we talk about culturally responsive pedagogy, we have to remember that students approach learning not as cultural blank slates. So they bring into the classroom all of those cultural experiences. And so it is very compatible with what we know about good teaching. Culturally responsive pedagogy builds on students' prior knowledge. And in this case, we're talking about prior cultural knowledge, making connections between what is known and what is to be taught and understood.
So part of the argument of cultural responsive teaching is the dilemma has been an incompatibility between the cultural filters that have been used to send instructional messages to students that's coming from the school frame of reference, and when kids from different ethnic backgrounds are trying to learn that, they are trying to receive what we send from school through another set of cultural filters. And if they don't match, then nothing's happening. So cultural responsive teaching then says is that rather than always insisting that the students adapt to the culture of the school needs to adapt and modify some of its sending messages, its sending mechanism.
When we think about what matters most about culture, I think the first thing to remember is that students are not mere representatives of a cultural or ethnic group. And first and foremost, they are individual students who have individual needs and interests, etc. Students who belong to an ethnic group, their attachment and bonds to the group vary, for example, in terms of how long they've been in this country, social class, and their own experiences in the community and neighborhood.
Because if we think about students' culture, we make culture a trait of that individual based on his or her membership in a particular community, conflating race and ethnicity with culture. We don't take race off the table at all, but we're really pulling apart what culture is and making sure we don't conflate it, because if we do, then we make cultural practices a trait of that person's membership in that particular community. And that leads us, of course, to make very easily slip into one size fits all. that my Latino children learn this way, or my African American children need X, right? And so it's making culture a trait of the individual that's been very problematic in the implementation of culturally relevant pedagogy.
So I think one of the really important pieces to take away from this video is that we do not want to lump all children of the same race into one set of culture, right? Just like what she was saying. We never want to generalize to say all my Black students learn this way, or all my Black students can't do this, or all my Latino students learn this way. But being really cognizant of the individuality of each student as well. And that's where we start to get into culture and the brain, right? Really understanding, how does the brain impact, what's the influence of our culture on our brain development. And there is so much information in terms of the neuroscience behind this, right? To help us understand the role of culture. And really, when we talk about culture, it is the software that programs our brain, if we consider the brain and think about the brain as our hardware. Cultural values and learning practices transmitted from our parents and our community actually guide how the brain wires itself to process information and handle relationships. Neural pathways are overdeveloped around one's cultural ways of learning. And when you are culturally responsive as an educator, you know this and you piggyback on these already developed neural pathways with similar types of instruction, right? You tap into your students' neural pathways to help students accelerate their own learning. This is where prior knowledge comes in, right? Really leaning into, what do students already know based on their own upbringing, based on their own cultural experiences? And how can we tie that into the classroom? So this is an opportunity for you to pause and reflect. How are you currently integrating multiple different learning strategies in your current classroom setting? And where could you possibly lean into to build out additional and further learning opportunities? So I'm going to have you pause here. I'm going to continue with the PowerPoint presentation, and I will see you when you are finished with your reflection. So now we're going to start talking about social and emotional learning, or SEL, which, as we know, when we talk about SEL, we're talking about the information, the learning opportunity that provides a structure and process for adults and students to develop those fundamental emotional and social competencies and experiences. And through this, we know that then our students understand and can manage their emotions, set and achieve goals, feel and have and show empathy for others, establish and maintain positive relationships, and make responsible decisions. And if you have been at any of my webinars previously, I'm sure you have already seen this diagram. But again, I just want to really emphasize why this diagram and understanding it is so critical. When we work with students that are impacted by significant trauma, maybe neglect, domestic violence at home, maybe in the foster system, the juvenile justice system, they are really living in their survival brain, right? This part on the bottom of our brain. That's really their fight, flight, or freeze brain, because they aren't worried about their 2-year goal plan or their 5-year goal plan or even their 2-week goal plan. They're not worried about making rational decisions or processing information. All they're worried about is surviving. And when they are engaged in chronic stress at home, they are living in this part of the brain so that they can just survive, right? That's what their brain is telling them that they need to do. We then have this emotional brain, right, that is responsible for our limbic system. Our emotional brain really starts to fully develop and trigger during our adolescence when we're about 11 to 14 years old, right? Through puberty, as our hormones are processing and we're getting new hormones and new emotions, right? This is when we start to see that emotional brain really start to trigger. What's important to remember about the emotional brain is that when we or our students are in our emotional brain, we are not able to verbally communicate the same way. Our communication is not processing the way that it typically does when we're in our thinking brain. And because of that, when we have really strong emotions, this is why sometimes we have a hard time expressing ourselves when we're angry, or we don't know what words to say when we're extremely happy or joyous, because we are in that emotional brain. And then we have the thinking brain, right? The neocortex. And the front of it is that prefrontal cortex, our rational thinking brain, our processing brain, the part of the brain that helps us make sound decisions, helps us make appropriate choices. When we are living in our survival brain, our thinking brain is not firing, right? Those neural pathways are not developing like they should be, because we're not giving that part of the brain the opportunity to process information, to problem solve, to make rational decisions, because we are only worried about surviving. Social and emotional learning helps us regulate our emotions so that we have coping skills to push us out of our survival brain and back into our neocortex, our thinking brain. And by doing that, we start to fully develop those neural pathways in our thinking brain. And this leads to the full development of the prefrontal cortex in your mid to late 20s when it is fully developed. And as we know, we have this alarm reaction. The alarm reaction is when we are in our survival brain and we need to either fight, there's a threat, and we feel like the safest possible way for us to get out of the situation is to fight the threat. We might need to run or flight from the threat. The safest possible option is to run. Maybe freeze. That might also be the safest option, is to freeze in the moment. And then another new alarm reaction that has been studied more over the last 5 years is fawn. And fawn is when we believe, or when our brain tells us, that the way for us to survive is actually to give into the perpetrator, right? We see this when individuals get kidnapped and they start to believe the person that has kidnapped them, right? And they start to follow along with their belief systems and their patterns. What our goal is when we have minor threats in the eyes of our youth that we support, like passing out a homework assignment or asking having a difficult conversation, goal setting. We're able to, through social and emotional learning, pull them out of their alarm reaction and get them back into their prefrontal cortex. And that's what social and emotional learning is all about. It's helping our students regulate more quickly. We are providing them with the tools to self-regulate, to manage stress in a way that is more appropriate and a way that is more effective. We don't want our students to constantly be living in a fight, flight, or freeze, right? In an alarm reaction. We want them to have the coping skills, the regulation skills. So the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning, also known as CASEL, has laid out the 5 SEL competencies that school systems should be teaching, should be engaging in instruction on. We have self-awareness and self-management. When we talk about self-awareness, it's really an individual, our students, being able to identify their emotions, recognizing their strengths, having a sense of self-confidence, having self-efficacy. And then when we talk about self-management, that impulse control, stress management, self-motivation and self-discipline, perseverance, right? Goal setting. We then go into social awareness, and this is really when we want to teach our students about perspective taking, about empathy, right? Appreciating diversity, respecting others, which leads to strong relationship skills, communication, what type of social engagement, how do they build relationships, how do they work cooperatively, conflict resolution, in order to finally dig into responsible decision making. They identify their problems, they analyze their situations, they solve the problems through evaluation, through reflection, and they recognize their ethical responsibility in problem solving. This is what we need to be engaging and teaching our students about. From pre-kindergarten classrooms all the way up through high school and beyond, right? Engaging in this dialogue about what this looks like, what types of internal demons are students facing that is making it challenging for them to engage in impulse control, to have self-discipline, to identify emotions, to have empathy for others. How are we teaching this? And how are we generalizing it across school settings? Washington State has increased the social emotional learning standards from CASELs to include separately self-efficacy, where our students have the ability to motivate themselves, to persevere, and to see themselves as capable. So these are Washington State's SEL standards, and feel free to pause on this if you want to take a look a little bit deeper. Very similar to CASEL standards. And what we know about social and emotional learning is that there is evidence everywhere that social and emotional learning works to increase student gains, right? Our students have better social and emotional skills. They have better attitudes about themselves. They have positive classroom behavior. And what is so important for so many educators, I recognize this, is that when a school has implemented a structured and strategic social and emotional learning curriculum, and it's implemented across the school building, and it's done with fidelity, those schools are seeing an 11 percentile point gain on standardized achievement tests. So we're seeing we're seeing social and emotional learning impacting academic success as well. And the best thing is that us adults, we are benefiting too. Teachers who possess social and emotional competencies are more likely to stay in the classroom longer. We have the tools to deal with more challenging situations. We're able to work more effectively with the most challenging students. And as we know, working with challenging students is the main cause of burnout for classroom teachers. Now, a study that has been conducted over 18 plus years is actually showing that youth starting in preschool who engaged in social and emotional learning curriculum saw significant associations between their social and emotional learning skills from kindergarten into their young adulthood outcomes. So children who are starting in pre-K and kindergarten with social and emotional learning that is taking them through the curriculum through high school, we are starting to see huge outcomes for those individuals, right? In education, in employment, we're seeing a decrease in criminal activity, a decrease in substance use, and a decrease in mental health challenges. And this is one of my favorite quotes about education and about what it means for us to be educators of youth, right? Of individuals that are our future and the future of this world. Education either functions as an instrument which is used to facilitate integration of the younger generation into the logic of the present system and bring about conformity, or it becomes the practice of freedom, the means by which people deal critically and creatively with reality and discover how to participate in the transformation of their world. What part of education do you want to be on? What does this quote mean to you? And feel free to pause and reflect on that on your own. And I'm going to continue with the PowerPoint slide. So I want you to take some time now again to consider the iceberg concept of culture. Consider what is primarily in our awareness when we think about culture. And then start to read about what is primarily out of our awareness. And I want you to pause on this slide for a little bit, and I want you to look at these examples of what is part of culture that is typically out of our awareness. And I want you to think about what does this mean to you, right? What surprises you? What types of conversations or situations have you had with families that now, as you're looking at this list, it might have actually been a cultural difference? And pause here and reflect on that, and I'll and then catch up with me. And it is really important to recognize, although when we talk about race, we're not talking about culture, right? Race and culture is different, but they often are connected in terms of some cultural experiences. So, according to the National Education Association's most recent data points, and the NEA is a large education association, the largest in the country. What we know is that the majority of teachers are white. Between 83 to 85% identify as white, whereas students, almost 50% of our students are either American Indian, Alaska Native, Asian American, Black, or Hispanic. So about 50% of students are students of color. And what this implies is that there may exist a pretty wide cultural gap between us as educators, as white educators, and our students. And that's really important to recognize and to acknowledge. Our experiences are different from our students, regardless of their race, but especially if our students are of a different race. And demographic differences do imply that there are going to probably be some cultural gaps. And I want to make sure that everybody recognizes too, youth culture in and of itself is a culture, right? Youth, the experience that youth are having right now, what they're going through, what they're seeing today, is part of their cultural upbringing. And it's different than our cultural upbringing or my cultural upbringing back in the 80s and 90s. When we are culturally competent, moving into cultural humility, we understand culture and its dominance in an individual's life. We understand that in many cultures, group identity is just as important as a student's individual identity, and that each group of individuals has unique cultural needs. But there is diversity still within that group. People, depending on their culture, are also served in varying degrees by the dominant culture that they are living in. And culturally proficient settings enhance the capacity of every person involved. So if we bring in cultural humility to our classrooms, if we engage in the dialogue of culture and experiences and cultural experiences and prior knowledge, it is going to make everybody's educational experience in your classroom that much more enhanced. A great book to read if you are moving into Understanding and diving deeper into cultural responsive teaching is Loretta Hammond's book, Culturally Responsive Teaching in the Brain. It's a great book to do with a book group. If you have other staff members that are wanting to engage in this dialogue and this conversation. And Loretta Hammond herself has actually put together a book group guide. So it helps you and guides you through reading chapter to chapter with really specific questions to dig deeper into the work. And one of the things that she says, and the way that she defines culturally responsive teaching, is it's an educator's ability to recognize students' cultural displays of learning and meaning making, respond positively and constructively with teaching moves that use cultural knowledge as a scaffold to connect what the student knows to new concepts and content in order to promote effective information processing. You're tying together those neural pathways that your students already have based on their cultural upbringing and cultural background to the information you are engaging with them today. And a big part of building social emotional learning into the lives of your students is that knowledge of character, right? Our students having an understanding of what character means. So we are going to watch this video and hear it from the kiddos.
Are you ready to learn? Turn the big brain on. Culturally responsive teaching happens when I bridge the gap between what students learn in the classroom and with what they experience in their cultures and in their communities. The goal behind culturally responsive teaching is that students will develop their own voice and become academically successful, critically conscious forces of change in their communities. But before they can make some type of change in their communities, they first have to see themselves as having the ability to make some type of important change.
How I've changed was, at first, I was actually on a first grade reading level, and now I'm on a fourth grade reading level. I wasn't a good reader, but I still did it, and I became great. At first I didn't know my multiplication, but now I do.
And what helped you?
Skip counting and break addition. I have to work hard in this class so when I grow up, when I know enough, I can help people that don't have no home. I can give them food, and I might even start helping people by opening up a shelter.
Because I want to get an education. I want to be really smart, like you, Mr. Lancaster.
The reason why I work so hard in this class is so I can go to college and get my education.
What do you want to do when you grow up?
I want to be a dance teacher.
Oh, really?
I don't waste this opportunity because kids wanted to be in school, but it was segregated, and they did all of that for us so we can go to school.
I work so hard in this class because I want to become a teacher, but I have to still work hard because if I don't work hard, I don't get paid.
Why do I work hard in the class? Because another person could be in my seat. Some of our big girls in this class are becoming a great leader, going to the 3rd grade, and going to college. What's so important about being a leader is you have to have integrity.
It's important to have great character because in life, like when you go to college, you're gonna have like a hard time, and you have to have a good character because people in college don't tolerate nonsense.
I think that Ruby Bridges changed her community by going to a white school, even though her teacher was white, but her teacher still will help her, and the white people outside will just be mean to her, and I think she made a change because she kept going to a white school. Someone who I've learned about is Dr. Martin Luther King.
Yeah, what'd he do?
He changed his community so black people can do some things that white people can do.
Morgan is the man who saw the accident with the boogie in the car. So he decided the solution was he decided to make signals.
Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. he made important changes by bringing black and white people together.
Thurgood Marshall changed his community by he argued until black people was treated fairly as white people.
People are always just throwing stuff around and never recycling.
I want to fix that. People are getting killed, and I want to fix that by becoming a police or a secret agent.
The problem I see in my community is most black men killing other black men. And how I can help change my community by to tell them not to kill black men or women.
I want to help by telling people to do the right thing, and I want them to be inspired by me because I can show them the way, and leaders show others the way.
I just love that video, and I think it's really powerful to show what we can teach our students and the dialogue that we can engage with our students in the classroom. So putting this together, right, how do we have cultural humility and be responsive in our classroom? When we are culturally responsive, we need to listen, right? Above all else, listen to our students, learn from them. What are they telling us about their experiences? What do they bring to us? Right? What do they show us in the classroom? We also want to learn more. We want to engage in those conversations. Prepare ahead of time in terms of your lesson planning, right? If you are a fourth grade teacher teaching about the Oregon Trail, what are ways that you can integrate family immigration, family migration into the United States when you're working with your students? What are ways that you can talk about traveling and moving from one place to another? How else can students bring their voice to the table? And examine our own experiences and biases, right? What are we bringing to the table from our cultural lens? Which means that we need to be flexible. We need to understand that we are all coming from a different place and from a different lens. And when we talk about a cultural group, we still have to understand that there's a lot of individuality in that group. Examine the pre-existing data. Examine the research, right? Examine the learning trends for your area and be prepared to act in response to that. So let's put the two together, social emotional learning and cultural humility, being culturally responsive. Technical difficulties, 1 second. Stop my share for a moment. Oh, I feel like I have frozen. All right, let me try that again. I apologize. There we go.
all children develop social and emotionally, but we also know that there are a lot of systemic barriers or inequalities like poverty that affect children's social emotional development. Social emotional learning, also known as SEL, is the process through which children or adults they learn specific skills like managing their emotions, interacting with others, resolving conflict, and communicating. Focusing on equity and social emotional learning is important because it's an issue that a lot of schools and districts are grappling with right now. And they're both trying to understand how to develop social and emotional initiatives and at the same time trying to help serve all of their students equally. When you're dealing with children, you want to make sure to focus on all students' strengths and all students' differences to ensure that all students are developing socially and emotionally. Educators can ask themselves certain kinds of questions to help them ground SEL into equity. And those questions include things like, how can I differentiate my instruction for students? Where are my students coming from? And where might there be some systemic barriers? AIR has a lot of work in the area of social emotional learning and equity. So for instance, SEL Solutions is where AIR works with schools and districts to help them build their social emotional learning initiatives using data and evidence. There are a lot of different beneficial outcomes that can come from implementing social emotional learning with an equity lens. And this can include a lot of student outcomes like student engagement and self-awareness. And it can also really engender trust between students and their peers and also with educators. And it can help them to really better understand themselves and the community and help them to solve problems both within their classroom and outside of their classroom.
All right, so when we lean into making sure that the social and emotional learning that we are teaching in our classroom is through a culturally responsive lens, we know that one size doesn't fit all. Right, our social interactions, our behaviors, our emotions are intricate, they're fluid, and they are heavily influenced by other factors, such as our own culture, which means that we need to switch things up all the time. We need to engage in dialogue, engage in lessons, engage in how we are teaching, right, the strategies, so that as many students, that we're able to reach as many students as possible. Excuse me. It's also not a one and done thing. It's not a one and done lesson. We know that we need to generalize the content of social and emotional learning to make SEL work for our students, to get it into that prefrontal cortex, that thinking brain, to make sure it really sticks. Social and emotional learning is not just 30 minutes a day or maybe one lesson a week. It's in all academic settings. It's across all locations of the school building. It is in all classrooms. And more importantly, it is about the relationships that you are building. Building a relationship with each student is the precursor for building classroom community. Zaretta Hammond, author of Culturally Responsive Teaching in the Brain, states that the foundation of culturally responsive instruction is not technical, it is relational. It's about authentically caring for your youth. And Dr. Bruce Perry, a research doctor of trauma for youth, says that there is no more effective neurobiological intervention than that of a safe relationship. Our students need relationships with us. They need that encouragement, that connection. They need us to support them unconditionally. SEL also should be student driven, right? Our students should be part of the planning. They should be part of the learning process of social and emotional learning content. What does that look like with our youth? How can you get them to help build out the content or what they want to learn from social and emotional learning? Engaging in youth dialogue is so critical to this process. Having circles, doing daily check-ins, doing mediations, peer mediations. Regardless of the age that you work with, having circles and engaging in youth dialogue is critical for this process, building community and understanding cultural differences. And challenging injustice. What research tells us is that schools that are responsive to student concerns are going to produce graduates that have confidence in their ability to influence the larger political systems. Accordingly, students also benefit when their schools offer them opportunities to challenge injustice within their school community. Help build that and influence that growth within the school community. What does that look like? What are some injustices within the school that students can help engage conversation in and build up opportunities to challenge? And for some, there are some considerations, right? We know that to be culturally responsive, we need to know our students in terms of their academic record and their attitudes towards learning. What has their experience been so far? Why do they hate math? Why do they hate writing? Like, what is their attitude? What's their experience within the learning system? We need to first and foremost build relationships so that we can understand our students at their skill level. What goals do they have? What aspirations for their life? What are their interests? How can we tie their interests and pull their interests into what we are teaching? And we do need to develop or modify our curriculum to meet their needs. That includes academically, social and emotionally, and culturally. What do we need to do to modify the curriculum and make it more equitable for all of the youth that we are serving? You will have access to this amazing reflection opportunity through CASTLE, which is social and emotional learning through leadership beliefs and actions. This will be found, and it can be found in my resources. So if you go onto my website, which is www.innovativebehaviors.org, on the top, you'll see a resources button. If you click on that, scroll down, and then you'll see another button for links. And this will be in are we in day 5 or day 6? This will be in one of the folders that also about culturally responsive teaching and SEL. Thank you all so much, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.